Daron, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you to the National Library of Israel for the invitation to speak in this series. I'm honored to be here with you, unfortunately on a computer screen, but hope to share with you my research and a story of a cohort that to some extent has been forgotten. And my research traced their biographies and their project and the idea they formulated and they began to realize before the Holocaust in writing the history of Polish Jews. Let me share with you the PowerPoint and the story itself. And this is the image coming from the archives of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. I want to thank the Institute for allowing us to use it. So the story really is the basis of my book that came out a few months ago. And I will not be able to tell you all that I had uncovered and discussed and examined in a book. But let me start with one phase and one biography that you may be familiar with, that of Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian known, I think, most today as someone who envisioned, who created, organized the underground archives of Warsaw Ghetto, Onek Shabbat, Onek Shabbos archives. That story of that archive has been told masterfully in Samuel Cassell's book. But Ringelblum comes to play this role as a pioneer in documenting the Holocaust as the Holocaust is taking place. He's coming to it from a biography of communal activism and communal engagement, but also of academic training as a historian. So here you see a picture of his university diploma, which he received for writing a dissertation on the history of the Jewish community in Warsaw in the early modern period, for which he received his PhD. And this is really the heart of the story. How did it happen that on the eve of the Holocaust, we have a cohort of young Polish Jewish men and women who are committed to researching, writing, teaching about the history of their community. Now, I have a personal story tied to that cohort, and it sort of came to me with a delay. So many years ago, when I started learning Hebrew at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, my first teacher, beloved first teacher, was Rachel Garber. And she took me on one of weekends to meet her with her mother, who came from Poland, who originally came from Krakow, and we spent a lovely Shabbat together. And Safrira told me a little bit about her childhood, about her aliyah, her emigration to mandatory Palestine. Little did I know that many years later, I actually read her student file and read her dissertation that she wrote about the history of Jewish community in Krakow, and realized that Franciszka Wiesenfeld and Safrira Azrieli were the same person, that Franciszka made Aliyah, immigrated to Palestine, Israel in 1937, but she had that life of a young woman interested in researching Jewish history in Krakow. And she continued, in a way, this interest by becoming a teacher and teaching for many, many years, teaching history in Israeli schools. And I will take you at the end of my talk to these questions of continuity, but Francisca Safrira really in a way for me represents how much this is a story that ends with the Holocaust, but in some ways doesn't. Now, she was, as was Ringelblum, part of a cohort of young men and women, and it's not a coincidence that you see here images of high school diplomas. I like to show them because they have pictures of the young students that you see here, pictures of women. What is fascinating about this cohort of Polish Jews who begin researching the Holocaust, researching Polish Jewish history before the Holocaust, of course, is that there are so many women among them. Roughly 1/3 of those students who are enrolled in studying history at the University of Warsaw and pursue their degree, either MA or later PhD, writing about topics in Polish Jewish history are women. And this is definitely something new and in a way, I think, unique for the landscape of Jewish history writing at the time in Europe and possibly beyond. This is a cohort that emerges after some foundations are laid, and Meyer Balaban, the teacher of most of these young historians, either directly advisor of their degree, of their dissertations, their thesis, or someone with whom they had taken classes in the course of their university training, very much recognized that this was a new phenomenon, that the field that was emerging, that he hoped and planned and worked towards building as a field, rather than something that a handful of people do, that this cohort became an actual group that could create a field of Polish Jewish history. Now, of course, the irony is that when he celebrated that cohort, when he celebrated that success that was to lead to further research, he was doing it in 1938, 1 year before the war began, in which he himself and many, if not most of these young historians were murdered, perished. This is a story that takes place in Poland between two world wars in the Second Polish Republic. And I marked here on the map centers which had universities that attracted large number of Jewish students. There were two additional universities in Lublin and in Poznan. The university in Lublin was a Catholic university, and for obvious reasons, Jews were not enrolling there. And Poznan University was a new young university, but had very few Jewish students. It was not a particularly welcoming place, and the Jewish community in Poznan was very small. This would be a story for a separate lecture, for a separate talk. So Vilna, Vilnius, Vilno, Lvov, today Lviv, Lemberg, Kraków, and Warsaw were the four important universities. But for students who are interested in pursuing Polish Jewish history, really Warsaw was the most important one and the most welcoming one, and one that offered a clear path to specializing in this field. Now, the story, of course, doesn't start in 1918, doesn't start with rebirth of Polish statehood or renewal of Warsaw University in 1915. It starts in the late 18th century, and it's an interesting process in which we have Polish aristocrats such as Tadeusz Czacki and his groundbreaking treatise about the Jews, published, as you can see, in 1807. We have Polish non-Jewish historians such as Władysław Smoleński writing throughout particularly second half of 19th century, and increasingly also Jews who are interested in Polish Jewish history, such as Hilary Nusbaum, and he is, in my view, quite an interesting contribution to that field, because he's also interested in local study. He wrote on history of Jews in Warsaw and suggested even that possibly there was a little bit of oral history that he based his research on. He talked to elderly Jews, aside from looking at documents, but he was also interested in this longue durée of Jewish history from Moses till today. But Nussbaum or Matthias Berson or his son-in-law, Alexander Kraushar, none of them were trained as historians. They tended to be, if they had academic training, they were usually trained as lawyers. And history was a side work that they were doing aside from other activities. In a case of Berson, this was banking. In a case of Kraushar, he was very active as a journalist aside from historical work. But also Jewish history was never a focus of their writing. It was one of the topics that interested them. Kraushar, for example, was very much in favor of pursuing research that would include the subject of peasants, that he considered important as much as the subject of Jews for creating a comprehensive picture of Jewish past in Polish lands. Now, we get to another scholar, Shimon Ashkenazi, a scholar that has a complicated relationship with writing Jewish history. Now, Ashkenazi is already trained as a historian, but he receives his degree, his PhD, and his further postdoctoral degree in Polish diplomatic political history. And this is really where his heart is. This is where vast majority of his publications will be focusing on a history of Polish lands. He's, however, important for enabling for the field to emerge. He's involved in creating a journal that you can see on the left side, the quarterly devoted to the study of the history of Jews in Poland, a very short-lived initiative that only came out for 2.5 years, nevertheless was one of these new venues where one could actually publish on a topic that didn't really yet exist as a separate field of study. Ashkenazi was also involved in creating a competition with a prize that was based at the university where he was teaching in Lemberg, in Lwów. And that prize was given for the best research done by a student of Polish Jewish history throughout the ages, throughout the partitions. You could submit this work, and that competition would sponsor the publication of your work. Now, just as today, publishing was an extremely complex business. It required funds. It required a publisher that would be willing to invest. And so for, again, this new field, it was very important that there existed an address to send your research and to compete for the possibility of publishing your work. And indeed, all three men that you see in this image now, Meyer Bauerban, whom I mentioned already, Moshe Shor, and Ignacy Itzhak Schipper, all three of them won at some point the award that was given at the University of Lviv, and their work was published, creating in a way an academic circulation and readership for the field. Now, coming back to 1918, what we see in the Second Polish Republic in the 1920s especially is a shift. Shimon Ashkenazi retires. He hopes for a position in Warsaw, but he never receives a chair. And Lviv, that was quite welcoming and interested as an institution, the University of Lviv, in promoting scholars, young scholars of Polish Jewish history, plays an increasingly marginal role. On the other hand, in Warsaw, there is another Jewish scholar who is not himself interested in studying Jewish history. Marceli Handelsman comes from an assimilated Jewish family. He is interested in medieval history, early modern history, in methodology of history. In fact, I think until today, a part of the curriculum of historical study in Poland is one of his important work on historical method. This was a book that I read as a student in Warsaw a while ago. And Handelsman, like Ashkenazi, while not personally pursuing topics in Jewish or Polish Jewish history, believes in the importance of the subject. In a way, as a Polish historian, he has this inclusive, welcoming vision of historiography that should not be only the history of ethnic Catholic Poles. Rather, this should be a history of all those that lived within the borders of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And during the partitions, these were always multi-ethnic, multi-denominational lands. And so he, from the beginning of his leadership at the renewed Warsaw University, he's promoting that kind of history writing. And he is most likely personally involved in inviting Meyer Bauerban to take a position in Polish Jewish history at the Department of Humanities in 1927. Now, if we think about it, this is really remarkable. Salo Baron's important chair at Columbia University in New York, which is considered a turning point in Jewish history entering academia, this is not happening for a few years. Meyer Bauerban's chair is first. Handelsman also invites Ukrainian historian Miron Korduba. So again, this is not a particular interest in promoting Polish Jewish history, but an interest in promoting opened Polish or Eastern European historiography as such. And with Handelsman's support, he is in fact the advisor of Emanuel Ringelblum, whom I mentioned earlier, with his support and with the presence of Meyer Bauerban in the Department of Humanities, we have an influx of young Jews coming to Warsaw to study history. Now, some of the students that study Jewish history, that take classes with Bauerban, with Handelsman, they are from Warsaw. So in a way, the question is, why do they choose this particular path when they enroll at the university? But others, such as Fanny Kraszyńska, whom you see here, they come to Warsaw. It takes a tremendous effort, especially for those that come from families of limited means. And so therefore, I believe there is an actual desire by members of this cohort to engage with the topic. Unfortunately, the sources are very limited to trace their motivation. What I have had when I was researching it is, for the most part, their student files. And when they were entering university, they would be asked to write a short curriculum vitae, as you can see here, handwritten życiorys. But this was very formulaic. They had to say where and when they were born, when they studied in gymnasium, when they graduated, when they received high school diploma, and then add that they were of Mosaic faith, i.e. that they were Jews, if they were Jewish students applying for acceptance to the university. So there was very little space in this formulaic vitae to speak about what attracts them, what they wish to achieve, why they decided to enroll. But I think that even the geographic spread and the fact that for many of them, there were other universities that might have been even closer, not to mention other departments, that there is an intention of engaging with the topic. One of the students that I'm particularly interested in is this young woman, Sarah Eisenstein, as you can see from Łódź, living in Warsaw as she studied at the heart of the Jewish neighborhood in Nowolipie. And she wrote under Bauerban's as an advisor, she wrote a dissertation on the history of Jewish women in the early modern period, arguing not only that there are holes in the history of Jews in Poland in general, but that more specifically, that in particular women have not been studied enough. Something that reads today as a very, very contemporary call for filling the gaps in scholarship. This is a generation, as you can maybe get a sense from Fanny Kraszyńska, but here is Sarah Eisenstein's student file. This is a generation that not only comes from parts of Poland that may have been in different linguistic, political, imperial entities, right? Then they sometimes changed their schools from those that still taught in Russian into those teaching in Polish. They went to schools that taught in Yiddish. And you see that diversity in their files. They were asked twice during each academic year to declare their citizenship, their nationality, their mother tongue, and their religion. And here, Sarah Eisenstein, as you can see, declares as her mother tongue Hebrew, which is extremely unlikely for a daughter of a merchant and a woman to have Hebrew as her mother tongue. And this is almost for sure a political, ideological declaration of her likely Zionist leanings, or a declaration of her identity as a proud Jewish woman. But some of those students actually have different mother tongues if you compare their files between one year to the next, because their language identities are so complex and fluid. And just another example here of someone born in Białystok voivodeship, who attends a school in Łódź, who then continues to study in Łódź in a school that had Polish and Hebrew as a language of instruction. So not only language travels, but also geographic travels from Sejny to Łódź, from Łódź to Warsaw. For all the support that the field and the students might have gotten from Marceli Handelsman, universities in interwar Poland are not safe and welcoming spaces for Jewish students. And that situation is certainly becoming more problematic in the 1930s, although even Emanuel Ringelblum, when he first applies to be admitted to Warsaw University, he applies to study medicine, and he's not admitted on a basis of numerus clausus, of quota system that is unconstitutional. It is nevertheless practiced, especially by departments of medicine and law. These are the most prestigious departments, offering a chance, a promise of upward mobility. And Ringelblum considers studying medicine abroad, something that many Polish Jewish students did, especially men, but he decides ultimately to stay in Warsaw and to study history. That's how we get this incredible scholar and organizer of Onek Shabbat. So universities are increasingly hard to enter for Jewish students, and humanities less so, which possibly might be a part of the explanation of what draws this group of men and women to studying humanities, because they have better chances to be enrolled there than if they attempt to become law or medicine students. But there are also spaces of physical violence. Ghetto benches are introduced. They are much less physically dangerous, again, in comparison to other departments in humanities. And some of this is likely the influence of Handelsman and those young faculty that were brought by him when he was building the department and what becomes the Institute of History. Nevertheless, these young Jewish historians are not studying in some kind of a bubble, and they report incidents that happened to the participants in a seminar taught by Bałaban, incidents that occurred to Marceli Handelsman himself. And one of the questions that I ask is the degree to which this project really became part of Polish academia, part of Polish historiography, which was certainly the ambition that Bałaban and Shor and Schipper and Ringelblum had. They wanted to be historians of Poland by being historians of Polish Jews. So on the one hand, it seems that to some extent, it is a successful project for all the hardship. And this Conference of Historical Studies, international conference that met in August 1933 in Warsaw, could serve us as one proof of success. Here you see a special session that was organized for Jewish history, in which here is Meyer Bauerban, here is Raphael Mahler, Ignacy Schipper, here is Salo Baron, Philip Friedman, whom I will mention in a little bit. Two generations of historians, not accidentally, all those whom I mentioned are Galicianers, are Jews who were born, raised, and educated, at least until university, in Galicia, in the part of partitioned Poland that belonged to Austria-Hungary before the war. Another proof of a relative success are publications. Here you have the dissertation of Emanuel Ringelblum, published not by a Jewish publisher, but by a prestigious association of the lovers of history, published with the support and a grant that he received, again, through and with the backing of Handelsman. But his book was very harshly reviewed. And in fact, there were some voices raised as to why this grant, why this opportunity was given to Ringelblum, the opportunity that really should have gone to a Polish, i.e. not a Jewish historian. But this book is also interesting because it points us to one of the two important aspects of academic writing of Polish Jewish history before the Holocaust, the way that those men and women thought of pursuing this research. So one is without a doubt local studies. Ringelblum writes about Warsaw, Friedman writes about Łódź. You saw earlier a book by David Wurm, who wrote about Brody, Franciszka Wiesenfeld wrote about Kraków, and so on and so on. In many, many cases, this is not the case of Ringelblum, who is from Buchacz and writes about Warsaw. This is not a case of Friedman, who is from Lwów and writes about Łódź. But in many cases, people write about their hometowns, or they write about towns and cities where they reside, where they live. Why? Because they have access to sources. If you are from Brody and your family is a respected family, your father plays an important role in a community, you will likely know the people that might have the Pinkas, the communal chronicle, the documents that are not in some formal archive, that are still sometimes in people's private homes or in communal institutions, in the drawers there. And so students of Bauerban who are given these topics to write about their hometowns have easier access to material, and people who write about towns and cities where they live, also, they have a chance to do this research. There are stories about Ringelblum who would teach at the Jewish gymnasium for girls, but after classes were over, he would run to the archives to catch a few hours with the documents. Same Philip Friedman, who was teaching in a boys' gymnasium, Jewish boys' gymnasium in Łódź, and would do research in time that was left. But I think there is more to it than pragmatic choice. This is the idea that you're building the field by taking small bricks. And in fact, Moshe Shor formulated it when he first wrote about Jewish history, communal history of Jews in Przemyśl, his hometown, which is you write these individual communal histories, and at some point there will be so many of them that historians will be able to create a synthesis, to create a larger picture of the past of Jews in Polish lands. But first, they need those building blocks to be put together. And so Ringelblum's work and others are those building blocks to be used for further research into bigger questions beyond local history. The second aspect of this project is very political. Now, writing local history is political as well, because what you do is you inscribe Jews into the local history that often, unless it's written by Jewish historians, omits Jews, doesn't see them. It's as if Jewish inhabitants were not living there often for hundreds of years. And it's interesting, if you go to Wikipedia of various Polish cities, sometimes, or even better, to official websites of various towns, you will see that some of them have a section that talk about their history and mention Jews, and some are silent about it. And so in the same way, writing local histories makes sure that Jews are in those histories. But the second aspect is directly political. This is constant remembering and reminding the audience, both Jewish and non-Jewish audience, about the Jewish participation in Poland's struggle for independence. For the Second Polish Republic, 19th century is contemporary history. And all these uprisings and efforts to regain independence are at the very core of historical collective memory. And so it's crucial for Jewish historians to say, we were there as well. We fought in the Kościuszko uprising. We fought in the November 1830 uprising. We fought in the January 1863 uprising. We had Berek Joselewicz fighting for Poland's independence. And this trajectory of Jewish heroism, of Jewish patriotism, of Jewish loyalty to the Polish cause goes all the way to writing about Jews fighting in Józef Piłsudski's legions, Legiony Piłsudskiego, during World War I. And so this is not a historical narrative local, but this is a longue durée of sorts of Jewish contribution to Poland, not just by creating international trade, contributing to medicine, contributing to commerce, but fighting for Poland's independence together with non-Jewish Poles. And these are the kinds of publications that will be both books, both academic and popular books, but also in the Jewish press, both in Yiddish and in Polish. And really, it's enough to just check around the dates of the anniversaries of Polish uprisings to find endless articles on the topic. Now, it's very important for Polish Jewish historians to be in Polish academia, but they also envision what they do as Jewish history for Jewish history's sake, not only to be part of Polish historical narrative, but to be a Jewish historical narrative. And so there are institutional efforts of various kinds to create these institutions that will be the basis, that will promote, that will create space in which this history could be happening. One of the most important ones is the Institute of Judaic Studies. Today, in the same building, we have the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and you see here a group of students and young faculty in 1938 on the stairs to the entrance. There is research that is done and published not in Polish, so by definition, not to be read by Polish audience, although Polish publications, Polish language publications could be read by Jews and non-Jews alike, but you have a whole range of efforts to write Jewish history in Poland in Yiddish for Jewish Yiddish-speaking audience. One of those scholars very much engaged in that research is Bela Mandersberg-Schildkraut, whom you see here on a bench in a spa. She also, like I mentioned earlier, was engaged in writing local history. She was from Lublin, came to Warsaw, did her degree, went back to Lublin, taught at the gymnasium, Jewish gymnasium in Lublin, and did research on Lublin in local archives. And in fact, we know from the account of her colleague that she was continuing this research really until the very end. And unfortunately, she perished, and her manuscript of her work perished as well, aside from what was published in Israel after the war. And I mentioned this effort to create Jewish historical narrative for Jews, which meant going beyond academic history, which meant, by definition, engaging in public history, history for all. This also meant that non-professional historians, non-professional chroniclers of the Jewish past would be involved in, at the very least, making sure that the documents are safe, that the documents are collected. So here you see a call published in Literarische Blätter, very interesting high eyebrow Yiddish journal. The call is, though, to the general public to collect Jewish sources in history in Poland, signed by all the important men in Eastern European Jewish history writing. Here is Szymon Dubnow, Meyer Bauerban, Yitzhak Schipper, Raphael Mahler, and Emanuel Ringelblum all signed this appeal to the general public to protect and collect Jewish historical sources. And these sources were to become the backbone of the institution that never came into being, but that was envisioned, again, as an autonomous Jewish institution of historical research. That would be the Central Archives of the History of Jews in Poland. We have the Central Archives of the History of Jews in Jerusalem. But this archive in the making was supposed to be created in Warsaw, the capital, by another Galicianer and another student of Emanuel of Meyer Bauerban, namely by Hillel Zeidman. And in fact, there is a degree of continuity because during the war in a Warsaw ghetto, Zeidman was to head Judenrat archive division, but the archive of the history of Jews in Poland that he envisioned never came to be. And I mentioned this public history with public calls for documenting. This also meant that dissemination of history of Polish Jews was not only happening through academic or quasi-academic publications, but also through other channels. So one of these channels were rabbis who would speak to Jewish children brought to local synagogues on Polish national holidays, likely giving them short history lessons on the topic. I was particularly interested in the role of military rabbis in their engagement with young Jewish men drafted to the Polish army, who were also given sermons that were historical narratives about the history of Jews in Poland. And for the most part, this dissemination is done by teachers, through teachers, because young Polish Jews who graduated from Warsaw University, who wrote about history of Jews in Poland, were not expected and not expecting to receive an appointment, to receive a chair at the Polish university. The career that they could aspire to would be a teacher in a Jewish gymnasium. But that also meant that they had interactions with an even younger generation of Polish Jews, and that these lessons often were about history of Jews in Poland, often also local history of Jews. So not just history of Jews in Poland, but history of Jews in Warsaw, in Lublin, in Łódź, etc., etc. We know, for example, that Friedman in Łódź or Bela Mandersberg in Lublin would take their classes to the local Jewish and Christian cemeteries, would take them on field trips to see historical monuments and engage with these local stories about the history of Jewish community there. And here you have a picture of Falik Hafner. I suspect this is the first man on the left who was among the first students of Meyer Bałaban and who perished in the Lwów ghetto. Now, there is a degree of continuity that I alluded to earlier, but this is really a question. To what extent, after the destruction of the Holocaust, after the destruction of the libraries, of the documents, and after the death of many of these students of Jewish history, their teachers, and their audience, to what degree we can talk about a continuity. Now, one of those examples to think of in terms of continuity is Philip Friedman. He was not a student of Bałaban. He did not study in Warsaw. He, in fact, took the path taken by also by Salo Baron. He did his doctoral degree in history in Vienna. But afterwards, he comes back to Poland. He takes the position in Łódź, and he becomes a very, very active local historian and scholar, publishing in journals, publishing books on the history of Jews in Łódź, their role in industrialization, etc., etc. Now, after the war, having survived the Holocaust in Lwów, Friedman returns to history, but returns to history by focusing on the Holocaust. And that becomes, for him, a way to continue his scholarly academic activities from before the war. Just to share with you, because I was fortunate to receive the family album of Philip Friedman from his nephew. And this is Friedman's daughter, Alinka, who was murdered in the Holocaust. But other pictures here are post-war pictures of Friedman's academic career in Poland. he briefly teaches in the newly established university in Łódź, leaves for Germany, and then for New York, where he teaches at Columbia University. But while in Poland, he heads the Central Jewish Historical Commission, a very crucial institution for really setting the foundations for Holocaust scholarship. And you see here some of the important names, not only for Holocaust scholarship in Poland, but also in Israel. Yosef Kermish, who will head the archive division in Yad Vashem, Rachela Auerbach, who prepared the list of potential witnesses at Eichmann trial, Nachman Blumenthal, who worked in Warsaw and then in Western Europe, in Paris. And there's also a question of other people who were shaped by that experience of being part of the cohort that I was talking about, who left or who survived, who left earlier, who survived the Holocaust. So just two examples, Shevach Eden, whom I had the honor of interviewing in Jerusalem, who actually studied pedagogy rather than history, but who studied at the Institute of Jewish Studies, studied with Bauerban, heard Bauerban's lectures, and who then in Israel would work in the Israeli Ministry of Education. And another example, Dr. Israel Biderman, who was Bauerban's student, both at the university and at the Institute of Judaic Studies, who planned to go to Israel, survived in the Soviet Union, but who ended up in the United States, and as you can see, headed the Youth and Education Department of the Jewish National Fund of America, but who also engaged in a way in writing local history of his hometown by editing the Iskor-Buch, the memorial book of his hometown, Włocławek, where he wrote historical narrative along the side of editing other documents. So the question is, and I hope that this would be a research of someone to take on, I think to raise this question of the degree to which writing Jewish history in Poland before the Holocaust continues as a project, to what extent it informs historical scholarship today, but also to what extent it shaped teaching Jewish history beyond academia in Poland and beyond. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor. Susanna is asking for an explanation why so many women were involved in this group that you were describing earlier.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I only have a partial answer. Partial answer meaning this is guessing. My sense is that this has to do with gender roles, and that career of a teacher that was really the most logical outcome of graduating from the department was something that women could aspire to. This was an acceptable path for professional Jewish and non-Jewish women. Second of all, it's much easier to enter this department, as I mentioned, than other departments, but also increasingly, even if you're able to study law or medicine, it's very difficult to practice. The association of of lawyers of the Second Polish Republic at some point closes its ranks. You cannot enter it if you're Jewish. The Association of Physicians introduces quote unquote Aryan paragraph. So these are seemingly promising careers, but that of working in Jewish institutions, in Jewish schools, I think is more plausible. Now, I think there is also an element of centrality of historical narratives in a public discourse. And this might be coming from, to some extent, from youth movements in which many of these girls participate. Now, I don't know it specifically about each and every one of Bałaban's students, but this is in general a generation of Polish Jews who are very active in political movements. And in all of them, whether you are in Bundeszukunft or in a variety of Zionist movements, history is very important. And then history is extremely crucial in general Polish education and public discourse. All the story of partitions, all the stories of uprising and struggles and persecution. So I think this is something that pushes the young generation towards exploring history in which they may not see Jews visible. So there is, I think, a very natural urge for boys and girls to enter this training. But I wish one of these women actually wrote some kind of memoir testimony page in which they would explain why they were attracted to writing Jewish history as women.
Thank you very much, Professor. Nomi asked, was there a professional organization for Polish historians? And if so, were Jewish Polish historians admitted?
Oh, this is a great question. Thank you so much, because I actually this was part of the presentation that I decided to skip so that we don't stay until midnight. There is no professional association, but there are biannual meetings of Polish historians, and they could be seen again up to a certain point as a proof of inclusivity, because Jewish historians participate, they speak, these were published, and you see the discussions in print. Nowadays, you can actually download them from online libraries. But towards the end of the interwar period, even Meyer Bałaban disappears. And in fact, what we see is creating something that Sam Caso calls counter profession. I have a disagreement, because I think that there was more inclusivity that this counter profession suggests, but young Polish Jewish historians, young men and women who study at Warsaw University, they actually create a circle that they call a seminar of Polish Jewish history, or Junge Historikerkreis, and they meet separate outside of the university to discuss, to present, to compare their findings. Now, whether this is a function of being rejected, I don't think so, because it starts in the 1920s. In this case, it really stems from their conviction that they have their own methodological questions to solve that are not addressed in regular classes. But I think that this is a circle that will become increasingly a safe space when we move into the 30s.
Thank you very much. Adam asks, we've heard about anti-Semitism towards Jewish scholars before the war. What is the situation in the Polish Academy nowadays?
This is a complicated question, but because the interwar period, the great part of the anti-Semitic discourse at the time is "quote unquote" overrepresentation of Jews, right? In official documents, heads of departments and members of faculty discuss how many Jews applied, and there is almost a sense of panic that Jews are taking entrance exams better than other candidates, and that this needs to be somehow managed. So today, obviously, there's no such problem. It has more to do, I think, with the discourse about the Jews, especially with regard to the Holocaust. You may have heard that 2 Polish historians were actually put on trial. And this is more, I mean, the subject of the Holocaust is the particularly sensitive subject. So if one was to speak about anti-Semitism, I think this is primarily through this lens that we would see certain continuities. Now, it also has to do with a desire to present a very pleasant vision of the Polish Jewish past. So this has not only to do with how do you talk about the Holocaust and the behavior of non-Jewish neighbors, but it might also push towards, and the violence against survivors after the war, but it may also enter the space of discussing interwar period. So to what extent, for example, historians are willing to discuss violence, to what extent they're willing to discuss ghetto benches, etc., etc. But it's I think it's a very different phenomenon to an extent. The social context is very different. But thank you for this question.
Thank you very much. Marcia asks, how accessible are the writings of the many mentioned in this enlightening lecture, especially in English translation?
Yeah, not enough. Bałaban's seminal work was on the history of Jews in Kraków and Kazimierz was translated into Hebrew, and I highly recommend it. But no, not really. Yeah, something to really be thinking of, the extent to which, if we were to translate some of these studies, how well did they age? And I must say that while I'm obviously in love with this cohort of scholars, I also want to make it clear that when you read those, especially those that are still, left in their student files, their dissertations, their thesis, handwritten or even typed, they probably would not pass today the standards of MA. Some of them might not even pass the standards of BA. So this is not necessarily research that in and of itself is groundbreaking today, but in the context of the time, the effort and the agency of this research, I think, continues to be interesting and relevant.
Thank you very much. Yola asks, first of all, she says, thank you very much for this initiative and this conference. And then she asks, how could I go deeper into the subject? Where can I find sources or studies on this subject?
Well, I hate to say I wrote a book about it, so I would love for you to look there. I also would very highly recommend Samuel Cassell's book, Who Will Write Our History. Although the heart of the book is on Oneg Shabbat, but the initial chapters talk about the social context, intellectual context before the war. And between my book and Sam Cassell's book, I think you'll have some direction in terms of further studies. There's also a new book, Yiddish Historians, by Mark Smith. He focuses on writing about the Holocaust in Yiddish by Jewish historians. But again, that pre-war intellectual history is part of the background. And I say that I would say also it's a in a way it's a bigger question of integrated humanities. And I hope that there's going to be a lot more of research that looks into sociology, ethnography, anthropology in the case of my intellectual milieu of Poland, because in all these fields, the question of participation of Jewish scholars matters a great deal. And I'm glad I remembered. I would also recommend Cecile Kuznitz's book on Ivo. I skipped Ivo completely, the Jewish Scholar Research Institute. Today it's Jewish Research Institute in New York, but the first one was in Vilna, and while history was not its primary focus, Kuznitz's book also touches on that intellectual milieu of young Jews and their intellectual ambitions.
Thank you very much. Nomi asks, do you think that this separation, so to speak, prompted Riegelbaum to determine that the who in Who Will Write Our History has to be we or no other historian would?
That's an interesting question. I think that in a case of Ringelblum, and in fact, there is an account by a survivor of a very similar statement made by Yitzhak Ignacy Schipper in Majdanek, where he was murdered. This is more a question of we Jewish victims or the perpetrators. The perpetrators, meaning the Germans, will be writing the history of what happened. So I think the distinction here is not so much between Polish historians marginalizing us, but rather history written by the victims, and we need to make sure that this is done by us. And I think also, I have a project that is a project-based Holocaust history project based on testimonies, diaries, and memoirs of survivors. That notion that if the destruction of Polish Jewry is complete, who will tell about us, goes far beyond the scope of professional historians. This is very much a common anxiety and pain and fear, and something that people raise who are not trained historians.
Thank you very, very much.
This is a great question. Thank you. I will continue thinking about it after the Zoom.
Thank you very much, Professor Natalia Aleksiun. I'll post the link to our website once more, and I'm going to open microphones so that people can ask questions or comment and anything further. I think Jan had a question, but I'm not sure he's still here. In any case, the microphones are open. Thank you all for being with us this evening. Thank you again, Professor. Laila Tov.
Thank you.
The microphones are open.
Shalom Tova. And I saw that Professor Walensky had a hand up. I don't know if...
Sorry, okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so, I have two additions. One is that in general, education of Jewish women in Poland was better developed than non-Jewish women. I think that it was one of reasons that so many Jewish students entered universities. For example, we have several interesting philosophers, professional philosophers, and even before 1930. I can, but that's what.
I know, I agree 100%.
International, but another interesting thing is that many Jewish students who were very far from history, for example, mathematicians, were interested in Jewish history, and I inspected some indexes of famous Polish logicians like Adolf Lindenbaum, who attended in the 20s courses in Jewish culture and Jewish history. And you know, it was a kind of, I think it is a topic which should be investigated. And another example, Alfred Tarski, Teitelbaum by family. This is a story told by Czesław Miłosz, who was very proud that he translated as the first fragment of Torah into Polish. And he told Tarski, and Tarski told him not, because Isaac Cylkow was the first. And what is interesting, that Tarski knew that, probably from family teaching or maybe at university. So this solidarity of young Jews with own history is something very remarkable. And one explanation concerning the role of anti-Semitism or something like that in Polish Academia at the moment. So it's practically not, I think, except discussions among about Holocaust, around Holocaust. For example, Barbara Engelking was elected to Polish Academy of Sciences, and he won the largest number of votes in our faculty. So the only one event was 68. It was really Jewish scholars were oppressed, expelled from jobs, and so on. However, later, maybe only occasional voices, but not relevant. I remember that one of my colleagues went to the rectors and said, "Oh, we should defend university against Jan Woleński because he's Jewish," but the rector simply ignored.
Thank you very much. Okay. Patricia, you had a question?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Woleński.
Patricia?
And it's wonderful to know about the highest number of votes, which is implied by the fact that Barbara Engelking won, but thank you for spelling it out.
Okay, any other questions? If not, thank you all once more for being here. Thank you, Professor Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
Laila Tov, and be well and healthy, everybody. Stay well.